My parents didn't come to my wedding, not because they couldn't, not because something unexpected happened. They chose not to. My mother told me that 3 days before the ceremony, her voice was calm, measured. Don't expect us there, Olivia. No anger, no hesitation, just a decision. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, staring at nothing in particular. Okay, I said, because sometimes when something has been building for years, it doesn't shock you when it finally arrives. It just confirms something you already knew. My name is Olivia Mercer, and if you had met my family, you would have thought I had everything figured out. Good education, good career, the kind of life that looks stable from the outside. And for most of my life, I did exactly what was expected of me. Not because I agreed with it, because I understood the system. My mother, Patricia Mercer, doesn't reject people directly. She never has. She evaluates them, sorts them, places them into categories she never says out loud. Promising, appropriate, temporary, and sometimes, without ever using the word, not enough. I learned early on that approval in my family wasn't something you were given. It was something you maintained, carefully, consistently, at a cost you didn't fully understand until much later. So I adapted. I dated the right kind of men, brought home the ones who fit the outline. An architect, a consultant, someone with the right background, the right connections, the right future. My mother approved of all of them. None of them stayed. Because approval, I learned, has nothing to do with compatibility. It has everything to do with perception. Then I met him. His name was Ethan Cole. And the first thing he ever said to me wasn't impressive, wasn't strategic. It was correct. That drainage line is going to fail in the next heavy rain, he said, standing behind me on a construction site, looking at a slope no one else had noticed. I turned around, looked at him, then at the land, and realized he was right. Not approximately, not theoretically, exactly. That was the first thing I learned about Ethan. He didn't guess, he understood. And more importantly, he didn't feel the need to prove it. He just said it, simply, calmly, like truth didn't require permission. I should have known, right then, that nothing about him would fit into the life my family had planned for me. Not his work, not his background, not the way he moved through the world like he didn't need anyone to approve of him. And definitely not the version of him my family was about to meet. Because when I finally brought Ethan home, they didn't see a man. They saw a problem, and they had already decided how to solve it. The first time Ethan met my family, nothing went wrong. That was the strange part. No one raised their voice. No one said anything openly disrespectful. Dinner was polite. My mother smiled. My father asked questions, the kind that sound normal until you listen closely. How long have you been doing that kind of work, Ethan? About 8 years. My father nodded. Slow, measured. And you enjoy it? A simple question, but not really. Because in my family, enjoyment isn't the metric. Trajectory is. Ethan didn't hesitate. I do, he said. No elaboration. No attempt to reframe it into something more impressive. Just the truth. That was his second mistake. The first was walking in without needing approval. The second was answering honestly. My mother leaned slightly forward. And do you plan to expand? She asked. There it was. Not what do you do, but what are you becoming? Because in her world, who you are now doesn't matter. Only where you're going. Ethan glanced at her, then back at his plate. I already have, he said. Another simple answer, but not the one she wanted. She smiled. Polite. Controlled. Of course, she said. And just like that, the conversation moved on. No conflict. No disagreement. Just adjustment. That was how my mother rejected people. She didn't push them out. She repositioned them. Lower. Subtly. Quietly. Until everyone in the room understood, without being told. The rest of the dinner followed the same pattern. Questions that weren't really questions. Comments that sounded neutral, but carried conclusions inside them. And Ethan didn't fight any of it. He didn't try to impress them. Didn't over-explain. Didn't correct their assumptions. He just stayed the same. Calm. Certain. Unmoved. At the time, I thought that would hurt him. That eventually he would notice. That he would feel the distance. But he didn't. Or, if he didn't treat it like something that needed to be fixed. That was the part I didn't understand yet. After dinner, we walked out to the car. The air was cooler than I expected. I glanced at him, waiting for a reaction. I questioned something. What? He asked, unlocking the door. I hesitated. Nothing, I said. He looked at me for a second longer, then nodded. And that was it. No analysis, no replaying the night, no trying to interpret what had just happened. Because he already had. He just didn't see it as a problem. That unsettled me more than anything my family had done, because I had spent my entire life adjusting to rooms like that, reading between words, decoding tone, anticipating judgment before it fully formed. And Ethan did none of it. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't believe he needed to. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently. My mother would call, ask about work, ask about my schedule. Then, almost casually, bring him up. Is he still doing field work? That pause, that small hesitation before naming what he did. It wasn't accidental. It was distance. Yes, I said. I see, she replied. And that was enough, because she didn't need more information. She had already decided what it meant. My father was quieter, but not neutral. Silence, in my family, isn't absence. It's agreement. One night, over dinner, he finally said it. Not directly, but close enough. You've always had potential, Olivia, he said. I looked up. I know, I said. He nodded. I just don't want to see you limit it. There it was. Not about Ethan. Not explicitly, but completely. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Recognition. Because this wasn't new. This was the same system I had been navigating my entire life. The same expectations. The same unspoken hierarchy. The same quiet pressure to become something that could be approved. And for a long time, I had played along, adjusted, selected, chosen people who fit the model. But this time, he hadn't. And they didn't know what to do with that. 3 days before the wedding, my mother called. I already knew what she was going to say, not because she had told me, because the pattern had. Olivia, she said, that same calm tone, that same controlled voice, we won't be attending. A pause. Neither will your father. I didn't ask why, because the reason had been building for months. This wasn't sudden. This was the outcome. I understand, I said. And I did. Because, in their world, this wasn't rejection. It was correction. A way of saying, you can still fix this. You can still choose differently. But I wasn't going to. Not this time. Because somewhere between that first dinner and this moment, I had realized something. Ethan wasn't the one who didn't fit. He was the first person who didn't require me to. And that changed everything. Because once you experience that, you start to question every version of yourself you created just to be accepted, and whether any of them were ever really yours. So when my mother hung up, I didn't call her back. I didn't try to explain, didn't try to negotiate. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to meet a standard. I was choosing a life. And 3 days later, I was going to walk into that decision without them. The morning of the wedding was quiet, not peaceful, not emotional, just still. The kind of stillness that comes when a decision has already been made and there's nothing left to debate. I woke up before my alarm. Sunlight was just starting to come through the window. Soft, unassuming. For a moment, I lay there, not thinking about the ceremony, not thinking about the guests, just noticing something unfamiliar. There was no anxiety, no second guessing, no internal voice asking if I was doing the right thing. Because for the first time, I wasn't measuring my choice against anyone else's expectations. I was just making it. Ethan was already awake. I found him in the kitchen, coffee in hand, standing by the window. He turned when he heard me. Morning, he said. Simple. No build-up. No tension. Like today wasn't something that needed to be managed. Morning, I replied. I watched him for a second, trying to understand something I had been noticing for weeks now. He wasn't nervous. Not in the way most people are before a wedding. There was no performance, no attempt to create a moment. He wasn't trying to make the day feel bigger than it was, and somehow that made it feel bigger. You ready? He asked. I nodded. Yeah. And I meant it. Not ready for the ceremony, ready for what came after. The ceremony itself was small, not intentionally, just, honestly, a quiet venue. A handful of people, friends who showed up without needing to be convinced. No extended family, no formal seating arrangements. And at the front, 6 empty chairs, reserved for people who had decided not to be there. I saw them the moment I walked in. Of course I did. You always see what's missing first. For a split second, something inside me reacted. Not sadness, recognition. Because for years, those empty spaces would have meant something. A failure, a rejection, proof that I had chosen wrong. But standing there, looking at those chairs, I realized something had shifted. They weren't taking anything from me. They were just empty. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was losing something. I felt like I had stopped giving it away. The music started. Soft, minimal. I walked down the aisle alone, not because I had to, because I chose to. Each step felt steady, not heavy, not symbolic, just certain. Ethan was waiting at the front, same as always, calm, grounded. Like this moment, like everything, was something real, not something to perform. When I reached him, he didn't say anything, just looked at me. And in that look, there was no question, no evaluation, just recognition. Like he saw exactly who I was, without needing me to explain it. The ceremony was short. No dramatic vows, no elaborate speeches. Just words that meant something because they weren't trying to sound like they did. I choose you, I said. Not because it was expected, because it was accurate. He nodded slightly. I know, he said, and that was enough. When it was over, nothing exploded into celebration. No overwhelming applause. No exaggerated reactions. Just quiet acknowledgement. People smiling, standing, talking softly. The kind of atmosphere that feels real because it isn't trying to prove anything. At the reception, things stayed the same. Simple, controlled, no spectacle. I noticed it again, the absence. Not just my parents, but the version of the day they would have wanted. The bigger venue, the curated guest list, the carefully constructed image, none of it was there. And somehow, that made everything clearer. Because without all of that, there was nothing to hide behind. No performance, no illusion, just the truth of what I had chosen. At one point, someone asked Ethan about work. Casually, so what do you do exactly? They said. I watched him, curious, not about the answer, but about how he would give it. He didn't rush, didn't adjust his tone. I build infrastructure, he said. That was it. No explanation, no detail. The person nodded. Oh, that's cool, and moved on. I almost smiled, because nothing had changed. Not yet. The assumptions were still there. The categories still intact. The same system my family used, just in a quieter form. And Ethan still didn't correct it. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't need to. That was the difference. I used to think silence meant weakness. That not correcting people meant you were letting them define you. But watching him, I realized something else. Sometimes, silence isn't submission. It's timing. Because when you know exactly who you are, you don't rush to prove it. You let the moment come to you. And when it does, you don't need to say much. Just enough. I glanced at him again. Calm, unmoved. Like none of this mattered in the way people assumed it would. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't the moment everything changed. This was the moment before it did. Because somewhere beyond this room, outside this quiet, controlled space, something was already in motion. Something that was about to reach us, whether we were ready for it or not. And when it did, no one in that room would see him the same way again. It didn't happen at the wedding. That would have been too obvious, too convenient. No, it happened 3 days later. I was sitting on the couch, laptop open, emails half answered. Still in that strange space after a major life event, where everything is technically over, but hasn't fully settled yet. Ethan was in the other room. On a call, his tone was the same as always. Calm, measured, no urgency, no attempt to sound important, just precise. I didn't pay much attention at first, because that was normal. He took calls. He handled things, quietly, without needing to explain them. Then I heard something. A number. 2.3 billion. I paused. Not because the number surprised me. Because of how casually it was said. Like it didn't need emphasis. Like it was just information. I leaned back slightly, listening, not intentionally, just enough to notice. Finalizing the acquisition timeline. Regulatory clearance is already in place. We'll move once the board signs off. I stared at the screen in front of me, unfocused, because something wasn't aligning, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet one, like pieces of a puzzle shifting into place without asking for attention. The call ended. I heard footsteps. Ethan walked into the living room. Same expression, same poster. Nothing about him suggested that anything unusual had just happened. Everything okay? I asked. He nodded. Yeah. A pause. Then he looked at me. Why? I hesitated. Nothing, I said. And that was the moment I realized something. I hadn't asked. Not once. Not really. I had accepted the version of him that was easiest to understand. The one that fit into the narrative everyone else had already created. And just like them, I had never pushed past it. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I didn't think I needed to know more. That night, I looked him up. Properly, not casually. Not the way people do when they're just confirming assumptions. I searched with intention, full name, business records, corporate filings, and that's when everything changed. Because suddenly, there he was. Not hidden, not secret, just not obvious. Ethan Cole, founder, principal stakeholder, infrastructure development, multi-state contracts, government partnerships, numbers that didn't just sound large, they were large. Too large to misunderstand. I stared at the screen, scrolling slowly, because the information wasn't new. It had always been there, accessible, available, just unnoticed. Or maybe unconsidered, because once you place someone into a category, you stop looking for evidence that contradicts it. And I had done the same thing, just in a different way. I closed the laptop, sat there for a moment, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just aware. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The way he answered questions, the way he didn't explain himself, the way he never tried to prove anything. He wasn't being overlooked. He was allowing it. The same way I had, but for a completely different reason. I looked toward the hallway, where he had disappeared earlier, and understood something I hadn't seen before. Ethan didn't need people to recognize his value, because his life didn't depend on their perception of it. Mine always had. That was the difference. The next morning, everything shifted. Not externally, but in the way the world started responding. It began with a message, then another, then a call, and another. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Names I hadn't seen in years. Family, extended relatives, people who hadn't shown up to the wedding, people who hadn't called, people who had already decided what my life looked like without needing to ask. I opened one message. Is this the same, Ethan? Another. Why didn't you tell us? And then, from my mother, we need to talk. I stared at the screen, because now the pattern had reversed. The same system, the same structure, but this time I was on the other side of it, not being evaluated, being reconsidered, and suddenly everything I had chosen was being reinterpreted, not because it changed, but because they finally had new information. I set the phone down, didn't respond, not yet, because for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about Ethan. Not really. It was about perception, about what people believe when you don't correct them, and what happens when the truth arrives anyway. I looked at him across the room, same person, same presence, nothing different. And yet, everything had changed, not because he became something else, but because the world had finally caught up to what he had always been. And this time, I wasn't going to rush to explain it. I was going to let them sit with it, exactly the way they had made me do for years. By the end of the day, I had 97 missed calls. I didn't count them on purpose. The number just stood out. Because 3 days ago, no one had called at all. Not to check in, not to ask how the wedding went, not even to pretend. And now, suddenly, everyone needed to talk. I let the phone ring, not out of anger, out of observation, because this part mattered. not what they said. But when they chose to say it, Ethan didn't ask about the calls. He noticed. Of course he did, but he didn't comment, didn't try to interpret it, didn't offer an opinion. He just let it exist. That was something I was starting to understand about him. He didn't interfere with moments that revealed themselves. He let people show you who they were, without interrupting the process. By evening, the messages had changed tone. Less curiosity, more urgency. We should talk. Call me back. This is important. Important. That word stayed with me because nothing about my life had changed. Not really. The same person, the same relationship, the same decision. But now, it was important. Not because it mattered more, because it looked different. I finally picked up one call. My mother, of course. She didn't greet me the way she usually did. No controlled warmth, no carefully measured tone. This time, she went straight to the point. Why didn't you tell us? She asked. I leaned back in my chair. Not surprised. Just confirming. Tell you what? I said. A pause. Longer than expected. About him, she said. There it was. Not Ethan. Him. Like he had become something else overnight. Something that required a different category. I didn't hide anything, I said. That's not true, she replied quickly. You let us believe. She stopped. Because she realized something. She didn't know what she had been allowed to believe. Only what she had assumed. I didn't correct you, I said. Silence. That kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full. Full of realization. Because in that moment, the responsibility shifted. Not entirely, but enough. You knew what we thought, she said slowly. I knew what you decided, I replied. Another pause. Then, the question I had been waiting for. If he had nothing, she said carefully, would you still have married him? I smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Yes, I said. No hesitation. No elaboration. Just truth. And that answer did something the information hadn't. It removed the leverage. Because now, this wasn't about his value. It was about mine. And that's where the conversation became uncomfortable. Fahia, you should have told us, she said. Her voice softer now. Less certain. Why? I asked. Not confrontational. Just direct. So we could understand, she said. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. A pause? So you could approve. That landed. Harder than anything else I had said. Because it was accurate. And accuracy, in the wrong moment, feels like an attack. That's not fair, she replied. But her tone had changed. Less control. More reaction. It is, I said. Calm. Because fairness wasn't the point. Truth was, if he had nothing, I continued, you wouldn't have been there. Silence. Not denial. Not argument. Just nothing. Because there was no version of that statement she could disprove. And we both knew it. The conversation ended shortly after that. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just unfinished. Because some conversations don't end. They shift. And what comes next is what actually matters. I set the phone down, looked across the room. Ethan was sitting at the table, working, same posture, same focus, unaffected. Not because this didn't involve him, because it didn't define him. That was the difference. For most of my life, other people's perception shaped how I moved, what I chose, how I explained myself. And now, watching him, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. You don't become untouchable by proving your worth. You become untouchable when your worth doesn't depend on who recognizes it. That's what my family had never learned. And what I was just starting to, I picked up my phone again, scrolled through the messages, names, voices, people who suddenly needed access. But access isn't automatic. Not anymore. Because the version of me they were calling no longer existed. And the one that did wasn't interested in being evaluated. Not again. I locked the screen, set the phone down, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt something settle. Not closure. Something better. Clarity. Because now, everything was visible. Not just to them, to me. And once you see things clearly, you stop reacting the same way. You stop explaining, stop adjusting, stop negotiating your place in rooms that were never built for you. And instead, you start deciding something else. Who gets access to you next? And more importantly, who doesn't. Because what comes after being underestimated isn't proving people wrong. It's choosing who gets to see you at all. And that was a decision. I was finally ready to make. I didn't go to them. That was the first difference. For most of my life, whenever something broke, I was the one who tried to fix it, explain, adjust, smooth things over. This time, I didn't. If they wanted a conversation, they could come to me. And 3 days later, they did. My mother called first. "We're coming by," she said. Not asking, telling, old habit. "Okay," I replied. No resistance, no accommodation, just acceptance. That alone shifted the dynamic more than anything else. They arrived in the afternoon. Same car, same timing, same controlled entrance. My father stepped in first, looked around the apartment. Not obviously, but enough. Assessing, measuring, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality and couldn't quite align them. My mother followed, composed, but not fully. Something in her posture had changed. Less certainty, more caution. We sat down. No small talk, no gradual lead in. She went straight to it. "We didn't know," she said. I nodded. "I know." A pause. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because she wasn't done. "You should have told us," she added. There it was again. Responsibility. Redirected. I leaned back slightly. "Would it have changed anything?" I asked. She hesitated. Just for a second. But that was enough. "Of course it would have," she said. But her voice didn't fully support it. "How?" I asked. Calm. Not confrontational. Just precise. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Because now, she had to answer something real. Not a general statement. Not a controlled response. An actual question. "If you knew who he was," I continued, "would you have come to the wedding?" Silence. My father shifted in his seat. Not speaking, but not neutral either. Because silence from him was always agreement. My mother looked at me. Really looked. And for the first time, she didn't have a prepared answer. "I don't think that's fair," she said finally. I nodded. "It's accurate," I replied. That was the moment everything settled. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. Because accuracy removes space for interpretation. And without interpretation, there's nothing to hide behind. "We were concerned," she said. "A different approach." Safer. "About what?" I asked. She hesitated again. "About your future." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was familiar. That word, future, had been used my entire life. To guide me. To shape me. To control what I chose. "Or your expectations of it?" I asked. That landed. Because now, we weren't talking about Ethan anymore. We were talking about the system. The structure. The unspoken rules I had followed for years. My father finally spoke. "We wanted the best for you," he said. Simple. Direct. But incomplete. "I know," I said. And I meant it. Because intention was never the problem. Execution was. You just had a very specific idea of what that looked like. Neither of them responded. Because they couldn't deny it. And they couldn't fully defend it either. That's the uncomfortable space truth creates. Not right. Not wrong. Just exposed. "I didn't choose Ethan because of what he has," I said. My mother looked up. "I chose him because of what he doesn't need." A pause. "He doesn't need approval." Silence. Again. But different this time. Heavier. Because now, the contrast was clear. Not just between Ethan and them. Between who I had been and who I was becoming. "For years," I continued, "I thought being accepted meant fitting into what you expected." My voice stayed calm. No anger, no edge. Just truth. And I got really good at that. Another pause. But I was never actually choosing anything. That was the part they hadn't considered. Because from the outside, compliance looks like agreement. It doesn't. It's just adaptation. My mother looked down briefly, then back at me. "And now?" she asked. A simple question, but it carried everything. I didn't hesitate. "Now I decide what matters," I said. Not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly, and whether or not it gets approved. That was it. No argument, no escalation, just a line, defined. And for the first time, They understood it. Not fully, but enough. Because something had shifted that couldn't be shifted back. We didn't hug when they left. Didn't pretend everything was resolved. Because it wasn't. That's not how this works. Some things don't get fixed. They get redefined. And what happens after that is different, slower, more intentional, built instead of assumed. I closed the door behind them, stood there for a moment, not thinking, just noticing. Because for the first time, I hadn't tried to manage the outcome. I hadn't softened the truth, hadn't adjusted the message. I had just said it and let it land where it needed to. Ethan walked in from the other room. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah." A small pause. "Everything's just clear now." He studied me for a second, then nodded. Like that was enough. And it was. Because clarity doesn't fix everything, but it changes what you do next. And what came next was no longer about proving anything to them. It was about something else entirely. Something I had never really done before. Choosing how I was going to live. Without asking anyone if it made sense. After they left, the apartment felt different. Not quieter. Clearer. Like something that had been sitting in the background for years had finally moved out of the way. I didn't sit down right away. I stayed by the door for a moment, not replaying the conversation, just noticing what wasn't there anymore. The tension, the anticipation, the constant need to prepare for what might be said next. Gone. Not because everything was resolved, because I had stopped participating in the version of it that kept repeating. Ethan didn't ask what we talked about. He never did that. Not out of disinterest. Out of respect. He assumed that if something mattered, I would tell him. And if I didn't, it didn't need to be explained. That used to feel distant. Now, it felt freeing. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water. Small movements, normal things. But even those felt different, because for the first time, I wasn't carrying anything into them. No leftover emotion. No unfinished argument. Just presence. "I used to think they were right," I said. Ethan looked up from the table. "About what?" he asked. I leaned against the counter. "About how things are supposed to work." A pause. "That there's a right way to build a life." He didn't respond immediately. Just waited. Because he doesn't fill silence. He lets it mean something. "I thought if I followed that," I continued, "everything would make sense." Another pause. "It doesn't." He nodded slightly. "No," he said. Simple. Not dismissive. Just accurate. That was the difference between us. I had spent years trying to make things make sense to other people. He had spent years making sure they made sense to him. And somehow, that created a completely different life. Later that night, isadat mu desk. Opened my laptop. Same inbox. Same projects. Same responsibilities. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had, because I noticed something. I wasn't editing myself anymore. Not in emails. Not in how I responded. Not in how I explained things. I wasn't softening statements to make them easier to accept. I wasn't adjusting tone to avoid being misunderstood. I was just saying what was true, clearly, directly, and people responded. Not dramatically, but differently. More precise. More aligned. Because for the first time, they weren't guessing what I meant. They knew. That's when it hit me. I had spent years believing people misunderstood me, when in reality, I had never given them a clear version to understand. I had been manageable, predictable, easy to place, and in doing that, I had made it easy for them to underestimate me. Not intentionally, but consistently. That's how patterns form. Not through one big decision, through 100 small ones. The next morning, I didn't check my phone right away. That used to be the first thing I did. Who called? Who texted? What needed a response? This time, I made coffee first, sat by the window, watched the city move, unaware, unaffected, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to catch up to anything. I was just in it. Eventually, I picked up my phone. Messages from my mother, from extended family, from people who suddenly wanted connection, not because they had changed, because their perception had. And perception is fragile. It shifts with information, with context, with what people believe benefits them. I didn't ignore the messages. But I didn't rush to answer them either, because urgency wasn't mine anymore. That was the shift, not in how they saw me, in how I responded to being seen. I set the phone down, looked around the apartment. Nothing had been rearranged, but it felt like a different place, not because of what was in it, because of what I was no longer carrying through it. For years, I thought independence meant being able to handle things on your own, to succeed, to function, to move forward without needing help. But that's not what it is. Independence is something quieter. It's the ability to choose without needing permission, without needing approval, without needing to explain your reasoning to people who have already decided what they believe. That's what changed. Not my life, my relationship to it. I stood up, walked past the desk, stopped briefly in the hallway, because I realized something small but important. I wasn't thinking about how to explain any of this to anyone. Not my parents, not my family, not even myself. I just understood it. And when you reach that point, you stop trying to translate your life into something acceptable. You just live it. Ethan walked past me, heading toward the door. Heading out? I asked. Yeah, he said. A pause. You coming? I looked at him for a second, then nodded. Yeah. And as I grabbed my keys, I realized something I hadn't felt before. I wasn't stepping into something I needed to prove. I was stepping into something I had already chosen. And that difference changes everything. Because what comes next is no longer about being understood. It's about how you decide to show up when you no longer need to be. A few weeks passed. No dramatic changes. No sudden reconciliation. Just distance. Not the kind that breaks things. The kind that reveals them. My parents still called. Less often. More carefully. Conversations were shorter now. More direct. Like they were trying to understand something, without fully admitting they didn't. Megan, my cousin, texted once. I always knew there was more to him. I read it, then put the phone down. Because that's what people do. They rewrite the past to make themselves more comfortable in the present. They adjust the story, so they were never really wrong, just early. But that's not how truth works. Truth doesn't arrive in pieces. It's always there. People just choose when to see it. And that choice usually depends on whether it benefits them. At work, things stayed the same. Same meetings, same expectations, same pressure. But I noticed something subtle. I stopped shrinking, not in a dramatic way, not suddenly louder, not more aggressive, just more exact. When I spoke, I didn't soften the point. When I disagreed, I didn't cushion it. When I knew something, I didn't pretend I wasn't sure. And the reaction wasn't resistance, it was alignment. Because clarity doesn't create conflict. It removes confusion. That was the part I had misunderstood for years. I thought being easy to work with meant being flexible, adaptable, willing to adjust. But too much adjustment turns into invisibility. And invisibility becomes identity. Not because it's true, because it's consistent. One night, I was sitting on the couch, Ethan across from me, reading. Same as always, no urgency. No noise, just presence. I think I understand it now, I said. He looked up. Understand what? I took a breath. Why none of this affects you? He tilted his head slightly. Because it doesn't change anything, he said. Simple. Of course it was. But I shook my head. That's not it. A pause. You never needed it to. He watched me for a second, then nodded. Yeah, he said. And that was it. Because the truth, when it's real, doesn't need to be explained. It just fits. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not the wedding, not my parents. The pattern, the way people decide who you are, the way they build a version of you based on the pieces you give them, and more importantly, the pieces you don't. Because that's where the real story forms. In the gaps, in the silence, in the things you choose not to correct. I used to think being misunderstood was something that happened to me, something external, something I had to deal with. But now, I see it differently. Being misunderstood is often just a delayed correction, a story that was never challenged, so it became accepted. And once it's accepted, people don't question it. They build on it. They reinforce it until it becomes something that feels real. That's how my family saw me, not because they were wrong, because I never gave them a reason to be right. And that's a hard thing to face. Because it means you were part of the problem. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to change the outcome. If you had done something differently, that's where control comes from. Not in what people think about you, but in what you allow them to keep believing. I stood up, walked toward the window. The city lights stretched out in front of me, each one separate, each one constant, and I realized something that changed everything. You don't need everyone to understand you. You don't need approval. You don't need agreement. But you do need clarity, because without it, people will define you in ways that are convenient for them, not accurate, just easy. And if you keep letting that happen, you don't get to be surprised by the result. That's the truth most people avoid. They say they're misunderstood, but what they really mean is they've been unclear for too long. And clarity takes responsibility. It means showing up fully, not partially, not strategically, fully, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it changes how people see you, because that's the point. If nothing changes, you're not being clear. You're just repeating the same version of yourself, hoping for a different result. And that never works. I turned away from the window, looked back at the room, at Ethan, at the life I had chosen, and for the first time, there was no gap between what was real and what I allowed people to see. That gap was where everything used to break. Now, it was gone. And that's when you understand something most people don't realize until much later. You don't get underestimated by accident. You get underestimated by repetition. And the moment you stop repeating the version of yourself that made that possible, everything changes. Not because the world suddenly sees you differently, but because you finally do. So, before you blame how people see you, ask yourself this: what have you been showing them that made it so easy to get you wrong?